Hi, welcome back. I'm Terry Burns, and this is a continuation of my class in the Monas Hieroglyphica or Hieroglyphic Monad of Dr. John Dee. And yes, I'm still using the translation that Dr. Nancy Turner and I did a couple years ago that came out from Ouroboros Press. But first things first, before I get started here, congratulations. We're up to Theorem 20, and that means you are among the handful of people until recently that understood these first 19 theorems in the last 100 years or so. I also want to just take an interlude here to talk about a few other things. First of all, Theorem 20 is a rather long theorem. I'm going to go through it piece by piece like before, but I've given you the whole text in the content section below, and that's important because as we get to these later theorems, it is harder and harder to get to any words, let alone words that are well translated. And there are a few key translation errors that people have made in other recent translations that make it really hard to figure out this theorem. The other thing is, if you have wondered with these discussions of world ages, and all right, the world, there's the Garden of Eden, and then it fell, and we're supposed to have a return to the Golden Age, is he going to get to that symbolically? Why, yes. In this theorem. That's one of the neat things about it. The other thing is some of you have heard me speak elsewhere about how he stumbles into an idea of higher dimensions in the hieroglyphic monad. This is the theorem where that happens. We have a decent amount of work to get there, but it's amazing when you see how he solves this. Now, I've dropped in another link both in the comment section and below. It's the article, it'll say by Robert Wilson, it's by Callie Wilson. So you can see how someone who is an excellent mathematician approaches this theorem. I'm a professor of languages and literature. I like math, but I mean, she does a much better job with this explanation of the mathematics there if you want to get into a lot of detail than I will. So basically what she's arguing is that D is solving the Delian problem or the doubling of the cube problem from ancient Greek geometry in a very novel and even transcendental way. Now, it's not a way that would hold up in terms of modern mathematics for reasons I've talked about before. There's a little bit more room for error if you're doing this with compass and straight edge than if you are using pi out to the, 3.1416 and then add as many other numbers on there as you want. You can't solve it. You have to take an approximation of pi to solve anything, which means your solution's an approximation, and that won't work. That's what the squaring of the circle, and a similar problem comes in with the doubling of the cube. So, but what happens is when D tries to do this, as I will show you kind of building upon what Wilson does in that article, is that's how D stumbles onto the idea of higher dimensions. Also, those of you who are in Rosicrucian or Kabbalistically based initiatory societies where you do interesting things with pentagrams, or maybe you have the top point of the pentagram as you associate it with spirit, or even in rituals, you talk about how a cross of the elements, if you pull the middle section out and up, you get the crowning point of spirit. This theorem is one of the sources, and I would say the most likely source for those things that you have enacted in ritual. Okay, so let me share my screen now and we'll get started. We're up to Theorem 20, Class 20, and as usual, I'm assuming you know who D is, you know what the hieroglyphic monad is, you know he's taking apart and putting back together this little glyph that is his symbol of everything. But more than that, I'm assuming that you understand the first 19 theorems and that you know enough about his context that you get his references to it because he's using this little glyph as a mnemonic device for things ranging from the Timaeus to the Bible to the Sefer Yetzirah, lesser texts like the Vo Archidumia he refers to. We just finished talking about Isis the prophetess to her son Horus. We've looked at D's likely sources of Kabbalah and noted how the tree of life he uses is the one commonly used in modern esoterica. If you don't know any of these things, I have 4 different playlists below where in some we're just looking at the letter to Maximilian and the printer, and others theorems, in some just word plays, and some related texts. But please take a look at that. Okay, now I want to point out one other thing that I haven't mentioned in a while, which is that D says he's explaining this little glyph, his monad glyph, mathematically, magically, kabbalistically, and anagogically. We've been talking a lot about alchemy, and I've said this isn't a work of physical alchemy, and Dee never says it is. So what about all the alchemical language he is using and why? I think this video is a good place to address that. So I will. First of all, the very last theorem you had, 19, was a restatement of the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, as you know. You also know that that can be considered it is considered by a lot of people an alchemical work, right? How the sun and the moon make the one thing, which is also the monadic thing. We had an earlier restatement of the Emerald Tablet back in Theorem 14. These were very short theorems compared to everything that was sandwiched between them. It's theorems 15 to 18. And it has to be significant that they are framed by two different restatements of the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, which is perhaps the lost alchemical statement of the ancient world. So it's a good place to talk about what Dee means by alchemy. You aren't going to have something like this by accident. It's too like long theorem, short restatement, a bunch of other long theorems, and then a short restatement. And notice this sandwiching is happening after, this is the fallen world. So the quick answer to his alchemy is you're working the way back up the tree. Metaphorically, it's spiritual alchemy. It's a metaphor. It's not physical alchemy. But that's almost too simple, although that's true. So let's just a quick review of what went on in these theorems that were sandwiched between two emerald tablets. First, you had the nature rejoices in nature theorem, 15, what my friend Vincent Bridges used to call the tantric key to the whole monad. And two recent videos I put online, one on the Turba Philosophorum and one on the Isis the Prophetess to her son Horus fragment. Both refer back to just this line, which he writes in ancient Greek. After that, we had theorem 16. That's the only source of the signs of the adept or analysis of the key word or light of the cross that you get in modern esoterica, which he says is the crux. The word crux in Latin is the same as cross, the crux of the matter. The light of the cross is his central symbol, all of the associations he makes with the cross. Then in theorem 17, you got 252 has the number associated with the philosopher's stone because it's what you get if you multiply the numbers of the Hebrew alphabet, the 3 mothers and the 7 singles, the 12 doubles, you get 252. And so he's in effect telling you that the magnified powers of the Hebrew alphabet, and essentially what you get in the Sefer Yetzirah, are the key to creation. I mean, that's kind of a wow if you realize, yeah, he means that, and there's no indication he's joking. Then you move on to 18, and you get 2 riddles that seem to be about what alchemy is. The first one is easier than the other to solve if you realize 2 things. First, that the yolk in the center of the egg is being fertilized by Tiphoretic light, and second, that you're doing a reverse lightning flash order up the tree. The second one, the spiral, is a bit more difficult, and there's all these feints to physical alchemists like George Ripley. But you solve it by becoming like the light of the scarab. The scarab is, we now understand why he would be making the associations with the scarab. The last 2 texts we look at come out of a Northern Egyptian fusion of Greco-Roman, Hebraic, Egyptian ideas. No, people in Dee's time period, no, they can't read hieroglyphs, but they have some of the Egyptian ideas, and certainly those that are in this great fusion that was Alexandrian Egypt. Think of the Library of Alexandria and so on. It was the center of Greek language and learning in the early parts of the Common Era. So the scarab beetle in that context, as I've discussed previously, just means Jesus. So, and you associate Jesus or a sacrifice god like Osiris/Horus with Tifereth. So you are becoming like the Christos on the tree of life. And you're becoming like the scarab beetle to purify the eagle, which is a symbol of the Holy Roman Empire, which can at times be like an eagle, rather brutal. And Dee knows that Maximilian, who he has written this to, is soon going to be the Holy Roman Emperor. It hasn't been announced, but it's just obvious he's next in line. And sure enough, 6 months after this, he becomes not just King Maximilian, but Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian. And then we get another restatement of the Philosopher's Stone. Only now, since it's a pyrognomic analysis, we're really thinking in terms of alchemy, of taking things apart and putting them back together and charging them with fire. Then we also have that the sun and the moon sustain corporeal forms better than other things, and we realize perhaps we're associating them with Tiferet and Yesod, that we're talking about the light flowing down the middle pillar of the tree. So what should we expect now in this next theorem? Well, first of all, it's XX, right? So theorem 10 was where we flipped one way. Are we going to flip another way here? Well, we're not going to flip the whole monad, but what we are going to do is symbolically have the resurrected world. So it's kind of like XX. And also remember all of the things that Dee associated with the light of the cross, or just the light of X, the Greek letter chi, like in Christos, but also two cones that intersect at a point, which will correspond to his cross. I did want to say a bit more about his alchemical language in those theorems that were sandwiched between the emerald tablet before we go on. So let me do that now. Of course, like I said, you can take the emerald tablet itself as a statement of alchemy, although it isn't a terribly helpful one if you're in a lab, if you are thinking of alchemy as turning physical lead into physical gold. In a similar kind of way, that last text that I took you through, the Isis the prophetess to her son Horus text, claims to have the secret of alchemy. It seems like an energetic or sexual secret, but it also at the end seems to fall flat. Also from the context, as we read through it, we suspect what she's doing is reanimating her slain husband, Osiris, another sacrificed god like Jesus, as her son Horus in the underworld with the help of an angel, Omniel, who we don't really see anywhere else other than in that fragment. So, you know, it's a reasonable question to ask what we're supposed to think by all of this. Is it Dee wants us to perform transmutations in the underworld? Or, well, Dee's a very pious Christian, so maybe we would say instead, how about the afterlife? Because in this theorem, we're also suddenly going to wind up in the hypersymbolic world of the biblical book of Revelation. So let's just go through a few things here. Dee has said he's explaining the monad glyph mathematically, mathematically, geometrically, kabbalistically, and anagogically. I almost said musically. It's like, it'd be cool if he did that, but he's not. He's using that language of physical alchemy metaphorically because the world has fallen in Theorem 10. It feels like he's trying to restore it with some kind of spiritual, kabbalistically based alchemy. And in fact, that's exactly what he's doing. If you try to read it as a text of physical alchemy, it falls apart. And you're just letting Dee basically punk you. And there's a lot of places where Dee will punk you. Remember, especially if you're a John Dee scholar, that the problem John Dee scholars have had is that they take everything he says straightforward in his diary, other places. And that's just wrong. He punks people again and again and again. You can consider the hieroglyphic monad the best use in the English language, or the greatest example in the English language of the so-called language of the birds, or green language, or using just intentionally opaque or misleading symbolism so that non-initiates can't understand what initiates are talking about. That's what's going on in the monad with all the alchemical language. It isn't about changing physical lead into physical gold. Now, having just released these 2 videos around that nature rejoices in nature quote, and recommending this book to you by Dr. Shannon Grimes, maybe we have a better idea also of what Dee thinks spiritual alchemy is and what perhaps he thinks initiation is. We know we are at a kind of flashpoint because starting with that nature rejoices in nature quote, he's not just doing a kind of feint with his language, he's doing a feint with whole text, that nature rejoices in nature. Well, it seems in the letter to Maximilian, he's talking about Democritus, or we now call pseudo-Democritus. Then it seems like, no, probably the Turbo Philosophorum. Oh, it seems like that. Then, no. Then we find out Dee owns the Codex Marcianus, or he's copied it, and things start falling into place. And that book he keeps secret that he's had it. He keeps that a secret from all but a few people for the rest of his life, or at least until he leaves it in Germany with a benefactor who he is clearly, from the marginal notes there, he's explaining to that benefactor. So I mention all that now because while the ideas in the Isis the prophetess to her son Horus fragment can allow you to go back and reinterpret kind of tantrically the ideas in Theorem 15, it also really applies, if you consider it energetically, to Theorem 20. The underworld, after all, can be another way to refer to the afterlife or the before life, or both if you put it in the context of the Codex, or at least the works of Zosimus of Panopolis, who, remember, writes after the anonymous writer of the Isis the prophetess fragment, but the ideas between both are very compatible. I want to tell you something that Zosimus of Panopolis, as an example, never says, and that is something Grimes stresses in her book. They don't ever say that they're trying to turn lead into gold. That's a Middle Ages, Renaissance, up to modern construction. They never say that's what they're trying to do. They're teaching how to make things look gold or sometimes look red. Part of the focus on different dyes and colors is that you're learning how to make things look gold for spiritual reasons. In ancient Panopolis, the home of Zosimus, by the way, they did have a temple of gold. They did, but it wasn't made out of gold. It wasn't like the King Midas temple. Come in here and you'll learn how to touch everything and turn it into gold. It was talking about spiritual gold. And I don't know Dr. Grimes, who wrote this book, but I would assume that's why she titled her book Becoming Gold. All right. Let me share my screen again, and we will get started on Theorem 20. So here is the first part of it. It's, if you have our translation, we're on pages 79 to 83. If you need a screenshot because that's easier for you than copying the text in the comment section, that's fine. So this is the first part of it. Here's the second part of it. The words he has in all caps in our translation are in all caps, and so on. The paragraph breaks here are actually where he has paragraph breaks. It's not one long paragraph like some of the earlier theorems. And as you get to the end here, you will get his only drawing, which I've just put on the screen there. Okay. Now let's go through it bit by bit, and we'll just read through the first paragraph. D says, we have sufficiently demonstrated above, using in good faith hieroglyphical calculations, that the elements are signified by straight lines. Still, we will here relate a most exact exploration of the almost central point of our cross. As concerns our ternary, that point can in no way be absent from that place in our binary. If in fact someone, unskilled in divine mathesis, were to contend that it is absent, then let him suppose it's absent. What remains will not be our binary, but because of the removal of that point and the resulting break in the unity of the line, a quaternary will emerge. But our antagonist had supposed with us that a binary would remain. There would be, therefore, by this same line of thinking, a binary which is identical to the quaternary. This, clearly enough, is powerless. Let's start up here. When he says we have sufficiently demonstrated above, he's referring back to Theorem 7, and also what Theorem 6 and 7 are the most important ones for you to kind of recapitulate to bring yourself up to speed on what he's doing here. You remember in Theorem 7, we talked about the world of being, perfect forms, and we were focused on this great Pythagorean cosmogenesis, I called it, the Plato's Timaeus. And so in the world of being, there are perfect forms. And then they go through the receptacle, the world of being starts, it's in motion, everything is a mess. And you have the 7 classical planets that are gods kind of keeping order on the chaos. So one of the strange things about the number 7 is it's really common in the world of becoming. 7 days of the week, 7 classical planets, 7 lots of things, but it doesn't appear like at all in the world of being. That is, if you look at, take a cube, the number of faces, the number of edges, the number of vertices, no 7. Same thing in a tetrahedron, an icosahedron. You get lots of 3s and 4s. You get lots of 6s, you get some 12s, you get some 8s, you don't get a 7. So he is also in that theorem adding together ternaries and quaternaries and getting 7s and so on. When you get to the elements, that seems to imply the quaternary. Later on it will, right? 4 elements. Remember, the 5th is usually hidden and associated with the dodecahedron. So these 2 lines, these are the 2 lines that make up his cross that he's called the cross of the elements, and their intersecting point is the point he's talking about here, and he went through that in Theorem 7. Before that, he went through something very similar in Theorem 6. All right, when you hit this word mathesis, if you don't know what that means, that comes from the same Greek root as learn. It's the actual act of obtaining and arranging knowledge, which you can here think of as taking apart this monad and putting it back together in different forms. Let's see what else we want to talk about here. Remember what he did with the rectilinear cross? A rectilinear, like four right angles, and he flips that middle point out implicitly, so you have a square. So whenever you have this rectilinear cross, you implicitly have a square. And sometimes you flip it, you always try to, if you can, flip it again into a cube. So you can see another progression here, which is from 1 dimension to 2 dimension to 3 dimensions. Eventually in this theorem, we'll have 4. This last word I'm going to talk about before the other things in the second part of this paragraph. This word powerless, it is incorrectly translated in every other translation I've ever seen as impossible. If it were impossible, then the whole rest of what goes on here would also be impossible. So he also writes powerless out in Greek, which is, as you know by now, a really big clue. So the only place I can find this in Greek is a rather significant place. It's the last word of the last chapter of the first book of Ptolemy's Tetrabiblios. I was kind of pleased with myself for figuring that out. I'd almost given up on this theorem. It's like, oh my gosh, it's powerless. So what Ptolemy's Tetrabiblios is, oh, and you notice book 1, chapter 24, we have 24 theorems. And Dee loves these kind of numerical echo chamber things. So the Tetrabiblios, just like the Codex Marcianus, comes out of this great fusion of Egypt in Greco-Roman, Egypto-Hebraic, and it comes actually from Alexandria, not further south in Panopolis. Ptolemy had been talking about how celestial objects exert more power when they are just above the horizon in the east. Like, what does that remind you of? Oh, the rising sun. But when they're below the earth, which would be the underworld from that frame of reference, they entirely lose their power or their efficacy. Then when they come up again, they're at their greatest power, their power wanes. When they are below the earth, they lose their efficacy. All right. We got to figure out what this point is. I'll give you a hint because I'm going to give you some homework here anyway. Think about that point as a 5th element, ether. I'll tell you why that is later, but if you need to relate it to something, you can relate it to the ether. Now, what about this line about the antagonist? Our antagonist had supposed with us that a binary would remain. There would be, therefore, by the same line of thinking, a binary which is identical to the quaternary. In other words, the antagonist, it may be right. We've been talking about fallen angels. Is that who's going to be right? I don't know. You tell me, because like I said, you're going to have some homework here. But I do want to point out, all right, here's his monad glyph he's taking apart and putting together. There's his rectilinear cross, or his quaternary. He is in a variety of ways associated this by dislodging the central point. So these four things become a quaternary, but he has the lines intersecting in that point in the middle as a ternary. And that's real similar to the drawing that you're going to get in the second part of this theorem, though we won't get that far today. We will get to the next paragraph, though, so let's go through this. He says, therefore, out of all necessity must the point be present, because along with the binary, it constitutes our ternary, as it did in those early theorems, and nothing else can be substituted in its place. Nevertheless, it's not of a hypostatic property itself, nor is it in any other way part of the binary. This will take you back to the discussion in Theorem 6. But remember, we've also talked about hypostatic in terms of hypostatic union. It's a concept in Christian theology whereby Jesus can be both God and man, perfectly divine and perfectly human. Now, in the subtext that we have been developing all through this, well, so are you, right? Because nature begets nature, so you're begotten by something divine. You've had all the arguments of that up to this point. You're anointing yourself and becoming the Christos. The Greek term that hypostasis comes from just means the underlying state or substance. So let's do this sentence again. Nevertheless, this point is not of a hypostatic property itself, nor is it is in any way part of the binary. Well, now this is confusing. It's not part of the cross. Okay, well, we'll just go to the end and see if we can make sense of this. That it is not part is here demonstrated. All parts of a line are lines, yet the hypothesis confirms that this is a point. When he says all parts of a line are lines, that's just a basic Euclidean concept. If you remove the point, then the line is going to either turn into two line segments or two rays. All parts of a line are lines, yet the hypothesis confirms that this is a point. Therefore, it is not by any way part of the binary, much less of the hypostatic property of the binary. Accordingly, we're especially noting that it has its own hypostasis and nonetheless is contained in those linear links of our binary. And since it is seen in this way, to be common to both, it receives itself a certain secret image of the binary. Here, from that place, we demonstrate the quaternary reposing within the ternary. I beseech you, my God, to forgive me if I have now sinned against your majesty by revealing such a divine mystery in published writings, but I hope that only those who are worthy will truly comprehend it. Let us now proceed to that quaternary which we have assigned to our cross. We would consider whether that point is represented, whether that point that is represented there can be absent. Mathematics actually teaches us that it can be removed. For not only does our quaternary remain there when the central point has been separated, but the quaternary has been made far more distinct and clearer for all eyes. So D says, basically, this displaced monadic point contains within it the divine and the mundane, or the physical world and the new, while connecting simultaneously to the union of the lines. If you conceive one of the lines as having no established endpoints, but only a displaced starting point, like you got back in Theorem 7, and that starting point in Theorem 7 is going to return to itself, which is also a kind of fusion of spherical and what we now call Cartesian geometry. Then you can imagine how D sees that this hypostasis of the point and the lines are an expression of that Hermetic maxim that you get from the Emerald Tablet, as above, so below. And as this theorem is going to later apply an addition to it, like as within, so without. Now, how does it receive that image? How does it show the quaternary within the ternary? Well, before we get to that, we have to figure out what it is he has discovered here when he says, I beseech you, my God, to forgive me if I have now sinned against your majesty by revealing such a divine mystery in published writings. So you can guess what your homework will be, right? With theorem 6 and 7 and anything else intervening you want to use, figure out what is it that he has revealed that he's asking God for forgiveness for. What has he revealed? Okay, so that is your homework. What does John Dee in this theorem, what does he think that he's revealed? Okay, have a great day. Bye-bye.